Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest IATA briefing on the COVID-19 situation. My name is Tony Consul. It's a pleasure to host this event. I'm here with our Chief Economist, Brian Pierce. This is a very special briefing for Brian. He'll talk about the 20-year forecast, and as Brian will be retiring from IATA shortly, it will likely be his last briefing with us. So I invite you to ask him all the difficult questions today. Also very pleased to be joined by Willie Walsh, our Director General, who will also make a short statement before we open to questions and answers via the chat function. So without further ado, Brian, over to you.
Thank you, and good day to everybody. If we could move to the next slide. So today in May 2021, we are essentially 16 months past that February 2020 point where we started to see the impact of COVID-19 affecting the travel numbers. I'm actually going to present a relatively optimistic view of the future, because although at the end of the first quarter, as we can see here, air travel globally was really only operating at 1/3 of pre-COVID-19 levels. You know, the lessons from the past, when we've had a demand side shock, for instance, from SARS, from the 91 global recession, the terrorist attacks, or the Great Recession, they have eventually seen a full recovery, you know, within 18 months in the past. Now, this one is obviously exceptional in its depth and possibly its duration. But I'm going to go on to suggest that you know, the effects in the long term are not going to be perhaps as bad as people fear. Now, if we move to the next slide, you know, this is an industry which has seen some pretty large structural changes, but they've all been driven from what you might call the supply side of the industry. You know, we had the jet engines in the 50s and 60s. We saw deregulation of the US markets and the EU markets in the 80s and 90s. That all led to what you can see is a really quite a dramatic decline in the cost of air travel. So the unit cost has fallen by 90% in those post-World War II years. Now, COVID has had the impact of raising the cost of air travel, but as you can see, you know, not sufficient to undo the enormous wider economic benefits as well as the benefits to users that these changes have brought about. And to a large part, the COVID shock is not a supply side damaging shock. And if we move to the next slide, I mean, just looking across from air transport to the wider economy, it looks to me as though we've seen, you know, a fairly V-shaped recovery in the wider economy globally. Global industrial production, as of the early months of this year, was above pre-crisis levels. So was cross-border trade, and that, as we know, has been driving air cargo to very strong performance. So in the wider economy, you know, certainly in terms of the level of output, there doesn't seem to have been this you know, substantial amount of damage. And in fact, I think this really adds to the arguments that there is pent-up demand for air travel. And looking at the next slide, you know, this is an estimate that Oxford Economics have done, calculating the savings in excess of normal levels of savings that consumers have built up during the lockdown periods of 2020. So in economies like the US and the UK, that's in excess of 10% of GDP. And even in continental Europe, which arguably has experienced more difficult times, that's still, you know, consumers have still got savings in excess of 5% of GDP. You know, potential travellers have money to spend. And moving to the next slide, I think, you know, the evidence is there of pent-up demand. Now, you know, the UK's announcement of the countries that they're placing on their green list for quarantine-free travel, you know, is a tiny number of countries. Even so, I think, you know, what we've seen happening to bookings in the 2 weeks following that announcement is instructive. We went from a point where bookings for those countries were over 70% down on pre-crisis levels to, on average, in the second week of May, being 25% above pre-crisis levels. A 98 percentage point boost, and that we've seen that repeatedly whenever travel restrictions have fallen. I think there's strong evidence of pent-up demand. And moving to the next slide, now that vaccination is being rolled out, this really should allow international air travel markets to open up more fully. Now, clearly, it's going to be a staged approach, as we can see from these forecasts of when populations will be vaccinated to the 75% level, which is being considered, I think, to be herd immunity. But in US and UK, that happens by the summer. In continental Europe, certainly by the autumn. In emerging markets, it will take longer, and perhaps not till 2022, maybe in some cases later. So there will be a staged opening, but vaccination should mean that there will be an opening of those markets, and it's the travel barriers, the restrictions that are really, in our view, the only thing in the way of a substantial and fairly quick rebound of air travel, of the sort of shape that we've seen in the broader economy. And if we move to the next slide, so we do think that this will be a period where markets will recover at different rates. But certainly we're already seeing domestic markets rebounding strongly. The big ones in China and the US, actually in the second half of this year, will be back to pre-crisis levels, if not in excess of pre-crisis levels. And even in Brazil, which is struggling with the variant of the virus, we would expect to see, next year, a full recovery. International markets will take longer to recover because we need to wait for governments to lower those travel barriers, which in turn will be dependent on the vaccine rollout, as well as getting those testing regimes in place. And you can see some of the differences in our forecasts, the forecast we've just released with Tourism Economics. The contrast, for instance, between our expectation for the US-UK market, an improvement this year, we would expect that to be one of the long-haul markets to open because of the widespread vaccination. Relative to, for example, China-Japan, the black line there, partly because of the slow rollout of vaccination in, for example, Japan, but also China, and also the very cautious nature of government. So it will be a year of contrast, but even on those international markets, we're expecting recovery certainly by 2024 and getting there closely by 2023. So what does this mean for airlines and for the regions? Well, the next slide shows travel to, from, and within regions. And so it gives you an idea of the sort of experience that airlines based in those regions will have. First to recover in 2022 will be those regions with large domestic markets, so Asia Pacific and North America in particular, followed by those regions which are much more reliant on international travels, for example, Western Europe, but also the Middle East as well, which will take a year or so longer to recover. And then what we've shown here is our expectations for the longer term growth path. Once we see travel barriers down and we see the underlying economic drivers of air travel and economic development and population development take force. So it shouldn't be a surprise, as this was our pre-crisis forecast as well. we would expect Asia Pacific to be by far the strongest growing region, with average annual growth in excess of 5%, but followed by Africa and the Middle East and emerging Europe. Western Europe and North America, we think, will revert to their experience of being relatively mature markets, and growing at rather slower growth rates after that initial period of recovery. And this pattern of growth, very strong growth in Asia Pacific, less growth in the mature markets of the West, gives you this next picture, which is a slide, which is if we move to the next slide, please. These points here show the center of gravity of air travel markets around the world. It's where air travel would balance in each of those years. 20 years ago, that was over Western Europe, or that part of the Atlantic, and it's moved steadily eastwards. In fact, last year it jumped to where we would expect it to be in 20 years' time because of the extraordinary nature of air travel in the crisis year of COVID-19. It sort of jumped because of the growth of the Chinese market and the closure of most other markets. So that will go back, but the path is clear. It's eastward moving because of the relative strength of Asia and those emerging markets. And actually, this is quite important for those airlines that are acting as essentially global super connectors. As you can see, there is a geographical advantage for those airlines based in around the sort of Gulf region, which we would expect to persist. But if I could move to the next slide, really just summing up the view on air travel. Clearly, this year it's been disappointing, and you can see actually we revised down our forecasts for passenger numbers in 2021. We're now expecting the average for this year to be just 52% of pre-crisis 2019 levels. But we would expect to see, as vaccination rolls out, travel barriers coming down. And once they're removed, we see no reason why we shouldn't see a strong, substantial and fairly rapid rebound of air travel, particularly leisure and VFR. Business will lag behind that, but next year we would expect to see the level of travel bouncing back to something like 88% of where it was pre-crisis. So a lot more for the airports to handle. And then by 2023, well above pre-crisis levels. And then sort of looking further ahead, what is the long-term damage to air travel in our view from the COVID crisis? Now, clearly that line tracks below pre-crisis forecast, the dotted line. The dotted line was what we were forecasting in late 2019. But the slope's fairly much the same, and the gap is about 7%, 10%. So essentially, our view is that the long-term impact is that we've lost 2 to 3 years worth of growth. But once those travel barriers come down, we should see a fairly rapid snapback. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. We'll now turn to Willie Walsh for a few comments on the outlook, as well as some other issues that we're facing with the COVID crisis. So, Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Brian. Excellent presentation as always, and very pleased to see the optimism contained in your report today. I think there's a lot in that short presentation that we do need to recognise. Clearly, it is being more optimistic about the recovery, both in terms of the pace of recovery, but also the shape of the industry going forward. And as Brian has indicated, the figures that you've seen in most of those charts relate to passenger numbers, which is slightly different to the charts we normally give you, which is in revenue passenger kilometers. And I think there is a shift in the shape of the industry as well, which is evident in what Brian has shown you there. Typically, domestic travel, which has recovered pretty much completely now, and as Brian said, we'll get back to where we were in 2019, or indeed in some markets above that. But domestic markets normally account for about 1/3 of all RPKs, and international 2/3. And what we're clearly seeing is that there's a greater shift in recovery and potential growth in the domestic markets than there is in international markets. So there's still quite a long way for us to go. We shouldn't in any way downplay the crisis that airlines continue to face. A crisis which I said on many occasions is not one caused by the health pandemic, because I think we're largely through that. The continuation of the crisis is largely caused by government restrictions on international travel. And again, you can see that we're optimistic that once those restrictions are relaxed or indeed removed, we will see a swift bounce back in terms of demand. So good reason, as we said before, to be optimistic. But clearly, the industry has lost significant growth, which will make recovery and repair of balance sheets a focus for all airlines, and that will take some time. So as I said before, I think you're likely to see a more cautious industry as we come through this crisis and go into the recovery mode. The critical issue is that the recovery in international travel can only really start when the government restrictions on travel are either relaxed or removed. And the message today is very simple. We've got to be ready for that. And we need to be prepared now. In fact, we should have been preparing for this for some time, because the environment we'll be operating in will be different in the second half of this year. So we've got to prepare for that, and I'll comment on that in a second. I'll show you a chart that we've prepared, which demonstrates the scale of the challenge. But also we've got to recognize that the environmental and sustainability issues are also critical and must be addressed. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But if we just go to the next slide, we've done some modeling. And you will have heard me comment on this. If you go back to pre-crisis, we estimate that on average during peak periods, a customer will spend about 1.5 hours in the airport going through the check-in, security, immigration checks where there are immigration checks, and then on arrival, immigration checks, customs and baggage collection, about 1.5 hours. If you look at today, where we're seeing about passenger volumes at about 30% of pre-crisis levels, we estimate that that time on average during the peak period has increased by 1.5 hours. And you can see it's principally on the arrival side with the immigration checks significantly increased, but also an increase on the departure side as passengers check or demonstrate that they have the required testing regime complete, be that a PCR test or a rapid antigen test, and that they've completed all of the relevant passenger locator forms that governments have introduced. So we've seen a significant increase in processing times. Now, if we model that further out with a recovery in the industry, you can see that if we get to 75% of our pre-crisis levels, that increases by 4 hours to 5.5 hours. And if we get back to pre-crisis levels, you know, we estimate that during the peak, it could raise to about 8 hours. Now, clearly, that's not going to happen because airports will not be able to function in either that 75% scenario or 100% scenario if we've got to continue to manually check paperwork. And again, this highlights what we've been saying for some time, that we need a digital solution and we need governments and airlines to be able to process customers almost as they did seamlessly prior to this crisis, and enable customers to check in online, to take the volume of activity away from the airport or else we will have chaos on departure. And then critically, we will have chaos on arrival as people go through the immigration process. If they've got to continue to prove using paper that they've completed their forms and have completed the right test. So a digital solution is absolutely critical. We need governments to agree on a common standard for vaccination and for testing. And we also need them to operate to that standard and to have mutual recognition of various government either certification processes or whatever system they put in place to prove that people have been vaccinated. So a common standard, if we had one globally, that would be a huge benefit. But where possible, we need to have common standards applied as much as possible, and then to have mutual recognition of standards and forms. And we think the G7 has a critical role to play at their meeting coming up in June, in mid-June, or I think it's the 11th to the 13th of June. If the G7 could agree on a common standard, that would cover almost 30% of people traveling. But the simple message is we can't go back, to a paper system that we abandoned in the industry years and years ago. We've had fantastic developments creating an automated and a digital experience for our customers. They love it. It has improved the customer experience. It has taken pressure off the airports, and it has enabled the growth that we've seen in recent years. And then getting onto the post-recovery phase, our focus on the environment remains unchanged. The industry, the airline industry, has long shown leadership in committing to very challenging goals well in advance of other industries. Our current target, as you know, is to reduce our net emissions by 50% by 2050. Now, that was done and agreed in an environment prior to the Paris Accord just over 5 years ago. So clearly that's something that we will be looking at again, but we've got a good track record and where we set ourselves these challenging targets, we have always achieved them, and in many cases we have exceeded them. So we now need other players to come and play their part. Particularly highlight air traffic control. We've talked on many occasions about the need to eliminate the bureaucracy and the inefficiency in European skies and to implement the single European sky. It has been estimated conservatively that could reduce CO2 over Europe by 10%. That would be a massive achievement. There's no technological impediment to that. Airlines have already invested in the equipment. It's on board our aircraft today. We need air traffic control providers, ANSPs, and governments to play their part. We also need further government support for the development of sustainable aviation fuels. There's no reason why governments should not support this development, given the billions, trillions indeed, of dollars that has gone into green fuels for other sources. Aviation has long recognized that we need to find an alternative to the kerosene that we're using today. Sustainable biofuels is a viable option for us, but we need to see the same support that other industries have received to get to a point where we can get volumes of manufacturing to a level that drives the unit cost down. And this is a job creator. This is really an opportunity for governments to create a green industry in developing sustainable biofuels. So our focus on the environment has not in any way waned as we've gone through this. I've said before, I'm really pleased to see more and more airlines invest in new technology, commit to sustainable biofuels, commit to other technological advances, and to put their money where their mouth is at a time when money is really scarce within the industry. So a lot for us to do, but it's very pleasing to see a note of optimism in the presentation that Brian as shown to you today. And on that, I'll pass back to Tony and we can start taking your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Willie. We've got a number of questions in the queue. Most are related to what we've just been discussing, but I also see there are a number in the queue related to Ryanair and the diversion. So perhaps we'll take a couple of those at the top, and then we'll move back into a discussion about the presentations today. So first question, Willie, to you would be, what do you see as the next steps in how the Ryanair issue, the diversion issue will resolve itself?
Well, I'm pleased to see that everybody has come together to condemn the behavior of the government of Belarus in intercepting and forcing the Ryanair aircraft to divert to Minsk. It's important to note that these issues, events like this, are extremely rare. But nevertheless, it is disturbing to see a government send a military aircraft to intercept a commercial passenger aircraft for clearly bogus reasons. Even if there was a genuine bomb scare, it would have been safer and significantly safer for the crew to continue to their destination and deal with the problem as we've been trained to do. I commend the actions of the Ryanair crew, who were put in an extremely difficult situation and clearly had no option but to follow the instructions given to them to divert the aircraft to Minsk. The response from governments to encourage airlines to avoid the airspace over Belarus was expected. Most airlines were undertaking a safety and security risk assessment, and I think we're likely to come to the conclusion that they should avoid that area of airspace. When I looked this morning, there were very few aircraft actually flying through the skies of Belarus, and that was to be expected. We would naturally now hope to see a political solution to this. We're an apolitical organization here at IATA. Airlines have plenty to do than to worry about politics. We've got enough on our plates to manage where we have direct control over issues. So we will be looking to governments to resolve this issue. But I think it is important that we have a detailed and fundamental review of what happened so that everybody can be clear about the steps that were taken, and more importantly, that the international community comes together and ensures that action like this never happens again.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. We have one other question, which I think you started to address at the end, but just to be clear, the question is asking, are there long-term implications to what happened earlier this week? And are you concerned, for example, that we suddenly see a new risk of political utilization of air traffic management? How do you see do you see this as a long-term problem, or is it a short-term issue?
Well, it clearly is a new risk. This is not something that we would have expected to see. Security threats are common within the industry, but are managed very well by the industry. It's the reason we have such a safe and secure mode of transport, in that we can deal with issues like this. But these sort of rogue behaviors are not very common. In fact, they're extremely rare. And I would like to think that this does not set a precedent. And that's why, going back to what I said, it is important that we build on the very public and united condemnation of this behavior that we've seen from politicians right across the world, to ensure that we don't see a repeat of this behavior. It is not what we expect when we're operating, and it is not what I think most governments would accept or indeed tolerate if somebody suggested within their own country that they behave like we've seen on Sunday. So it's important that we do fundamentally review this, and it's important that governments come together and reaffirm their commitment to ensure that actions like this do not happen in the future.
Okay, thanks, Willie. Now we'll move back to more COVID issues. We have one question which is talking about the summer. So first part of the question is, how optimistic or concerned are you about the pace of a European reopening this summer? And the second part of that would be the role that the UK, and in particular its green lists and amber list, will play in either encouraging or discouraging travellers from taking to the skies.
Okay, well, let me deal with that first, and then maybe Brian would like to comment. So I'm disappointed. I think the situation in the UK when they published the green, amber and red lists has been completely farcical, given the uncertainty that politicians created after these lists were published. We look at the data to assist us in making decisions, and fortunately there is quite a bit of data available in the UK. I've just looked at the most recent evidence published on the UK government site about testing of passengers who have flown into the UK. So the latest data is from the period 25th of February until the 5th of May, a 10-week period. And during that period, 365,000, just over 365,000 people flew into the UK and were subject to the regime where they either had to go into hotel quarantine or self-isolation and conduct a PCR test on or before day 2 of their arrival in the UK and on day 8. So of the 365,000 plus people that went through that system, just over 8,000 tested positive. Most of those actually were from red list countries. So the positivity rate was 2.2%, but if you exclude the red list countries, it comes down to about 1.4%. Now, if I look at it from the other end, if I look at the typical holiday destinations that British tourists go to, so I'll just quickly go through the details for you. So I looked at France, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. So from France, 96 out of 13, just over 13,000, a positivity rate of 0.7%. Greece, there were 16 people out of 3,280. That's a positivity rate just under 0.5%. Italy, it was 62 out of 11,000. Spain, 82 out of nearly 15,000. Portugal, 3 out of 1,000 people. You can see extremely low risk. And these are all amber countries with the exception of Portugal, which is green. But when I'm asked if I think flying from the UK to Spain, France, Italy and Greece, whether these are safe destinations, I personally wouldn't hesitate to travel. And I think the UK government needs to reevaluate the situation based on the data that's available, their own data, which proves that the risk we're managing here is actually very, very small and can be managed and mitigated by sensible measures. So we repeat what we've said, fully vaccinated people should be free to travel without restriction. Because the scientific evidence is clear now that not only does it protect the individual who's vaccinated, but it suppresses the transmission of the virus. And also from recent scientific research, it's shown that the vaccines are effective against the variants of concern that have been identified. So I'm still optimistic that we'll see good recovery in the second half of this year. I think we're heading in the right direction. I think if the data is evaluated properly and the risk understood, then there's no reason why we shouldn't see significant relaxation of restrictions. Maybe Brian, if you want to comment.
Well, only to add that I think you're right. The evidence, the data supports that there should be an opening of markets. I think that if we see some delay in government decisions, the summer season may well get extended into that shoulder season in the autumn. Those not constrained by school holidays will still, I think, travel in the later months of this year.
Great, Thank you very much, Brian. Next question, Willie, you mentioned perhaps a different shape of the industry, emphasizing short-haul travel being a larger component of the industry's activities. The question is, do you anticipate that to be a long-term shift, or do you expect a snap back at a certain point to the previous shape?
Personally, I believe we are looking at structural change. So we know that domestic markets are a growing segment of the industry. It has been a growing segment. If you look at China, clearly the biggest domestic market in the world, we believe that there will be strong growth there. I'm sure Brian can give a view on this as well. US domestic market, again, a very big market. Russian domestic market. So these domestic markets have great potential for further growth. So I think if we look at the traditional, and it's not exactly 1/3, 2/3, but it has tended to be around 1/3 domestic, 2/3 international. I think we will see domestic as an overall segment of total global traffic increase. But we will also see some changes. Brian has quite rightly pointed out that with the excess savings consumers have over the past year, we would expect greater consumer activity, so visiting friends and relations, travel for holidays and tourism, clearly a very important part of the business. And, we have commented before, maybe some structural change in the overall levels of business travel. I don't think it's going to be as extreme as some people predict. As I've said, this technology is fine, but it's nowhere near as good as being able to meet face to face. But I do think that there has been a structural shift. I also think that given that I believe airlines will be more cautious, that the long haul hub network will take some time to re-establish. Given where we were in 2019 with significant new destinations being opened, those destinations tend to be unprofitable in the early years. I don't think airlines will take too much risk given the importance of repairing their balance sheet. But maybe Brian, you would want to add or disagree with anything I said there?
Not at all. I think the forecasts that we've just released are entirely consistent with that view that, in the past 2 decades, we always saw longer and longer average trip lengths, as the last 2 decades were really about those long haul markets being developed relative to short haul. So RPKs always grew faster than passenger numbers. We actually expect the reverse over the next 20 years. So between 2019 and 2039, we're expecting passenger numbers to grow on average 3.2% a year. Actually, RPKs we're expecting 3%. Domestic is more important because of the opening of those Chinese and also the India market as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have a question specifically to the Canada-US border. And I guess there are 2 parts. One is, how disappointed are we that the border is still closed? And the second part is IATA involved in any efforts to get that border reopened? I know we have Nick Careen on the call, who's also based in Canada, so he might want to chime in with a few things. Maybe, Willie, we put it to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, and Nick certainly can give a much better view of this. I'm disappointed. As you know, our official head office is in Montreal, and we're still not able to travel there. I would hope that the Canadian government will start looking at a more sensible regime. My understanding is that you cannot fly into Canada unless you're a Canadian citizen or resident. But Canadians, I think, can drive across the border. I don't think that there's restrictions, or there may be some restrictions, but Nick can probably address that. But clearly, this is a big market. I feel really sorry for the Canadian airlines who have been hammered by the restrictions that the government has introduced there. And the government, although they've now come to support the industry, they've been very, very slow to support the industry in Canada. If you compare it to the speed at which the US move to support the US industry, and I think that's to be commended. We didn't see similar behavior in Canada, and that clearly has put the Canadian carriers in a difficult position. But hopefully, we will see that change. But maybe Nick, you might like to add some flavour to the situation.
No, I mean, we could probably spend the rest of the 20 minutes talking about how pathetic it's been in terms of how that particular market has been handled by the Canadians in particular. But we are trying, and we've been asking since the latter part of last year for some sort of roadmap in terms of what it would look like to restart, because it just doesn't happen overnight. There's been very little in terms of response, very little in terms of planning. Canadians have seemed to found themselves handcuffed by provincial politics versus federal politics in terms of how to manage the border. The pressures coming from the US, very little internally within Canada. So we try, we continue to speak to them. Hopefully at some point in time, common sense will prevail and we'll begin to see some indications that there is a desire to start working with industry to open up. But as Willie said, it's very disappointing to say the least.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Willie. We have a question about digital certification. So IATA is supporting that, but how quickly do we think that a digital certification system could be up and running?
Again, we believe that if a global standard is agreed, it can be up and running pretty quickly. We know that there are a lot of countries that have a central database of vaccinations. Not every country, but a lot of countries do. And therefore, it will be possible to move forward quickly. We're doing a lot of work. I think it is possible for this to be done in a reasonably short period of time. What is required, though, is that we get an agreed standard. We can't have every country demanding a different standard. That's going to be impossible. So, this is a time for governments to come together, accept a common standard, recognize one another's certification. We will need some form of verification of paper certificates, but again, I think that can be done. The issue for us is we've got to take as much workload off the airport as possible, because as we've demonstrated from the chart I showed you earlier, airports will not be able to function if everybody has to prove that they meet the requirements using paper. We've got to automate that. Now, we may not be able to automate it for everybody, but if we can do it for the vast majority of people, that will help in the short term. And not only help on departure, but help on arrival as well. So we recognize that there will be some manual processing required, but we will not be able to function. Airports certainly won't be able to function if everyone has to be checked manually. And I was on a call earlier today with the Greek Minister for Tourism. A fantastic approach to this issue, where again they're using data and artificial intelligence, to work out on a risk-based approach who they should be checking, how often. They recognize that there will be flights from certain countries that they won't need to check. There may be flights from other countries that may need some random checking, and others may need full manual processing. But it shouldn't be that everybody has to be processed manually. So I would encourage people to look to what the government in Greece is doing, and to learn from the example that they have created, which I think is really, really good, very positive.
Okay, thanks, Willie. We have a question maybe to Brian in terms of how you're seeing the near-term forecast. And the questioner is asking, how do we see variants in that? And, is the pandemic really at the stage where we can plan for, I suppose, border openings when we see potential resurgence in parts of Asia, Germany and Austria imposing new restrictions as a result of variants, etc. So maybe, Brian, how does that fit into your outlook?
So I think we are still in a very difficult situation. Clearly, the control of the virus, is not there. But that's, I think, essentially because we haven't seen the vaccination rollout that is expected. But the forecasts based on current rollout rates, existing orders, existing production rates, do suggest that a number of countries are going to be in a position where the virus will be under control, and there should not be any increase in risk from opening international borders. It clearly will be a staged process, and clearly we are not there yet. But the purpose of these forecasts today was to look, beyond today's difficulties at how we expect to see air travel in the future, because there's a lot that needs to be prepared for to deal with those numbers of people.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question about coordination, and particularly in the European context. So the questioner is asking, how hopeful are you of a coordinated lifting of restrictions and recognition of certification around Europe, given that harmonization has been conspicuously absent up until now? Maybe Willie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. We clearly have seen very little evidence of coordination to date, and I suppose the positive is that's the baseline from which we're operating. So if it continues as it is, we will be able to function. We would, however, be optimistic that it gets better than that. I think coordination in the interests of consumers, citizens in Europe, particularly in the EU, I think is very important. I've said this before, one of the fundamental principles of the EU has been freedom of movement. It's something that I think everybody has cherished. That has been withdrawn, removed, suppressed, whatever word you want to use, and that should not be done lightly. And it's very important that that freedom be given back to people. And there's no reason why we should not see the coordination of the re-establishment of a fundamental principle of the EU, one of the building blocks of the EU, freedom of movement. We can only get that freedom if everybody understands the rules. There's a common standard being applied. I think it's been very disappointing that we haven't seen coordination across the EU. I expect that to improve, and I'm encouraged by some of the measures that we see. It probably will take a bit of time, but I'm optimistic that we will get there eventually.
Okay, thanks very much, Willie. We have a couple of questions on vaccinations. The first one is asking about the, I suppose, growing problem of people being vaccinated and not being issued digital certificates. So how do we envisage the process of retrospectively converting those paper documents into digital certifications? Willie, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, we recognise indeed that will have to happen, and we clearly need to rely on governments, because this will be, a government process, but it can be done. I think getting certification or validation of the vaccinations that have been done, it's not beyond the ability of governments in this day and age to be able to do that, to find trusted source. But as I said, I think one of the things that the Greek government has done very well is using AI to assess all of the data, where we can't get it automated and get good certification in place. What you can do is you can put other steps to mitigate the risk, and that will probably mean some form of testing. But I think one of the things we can also rely on is, countries with a good epidemiological situation will be further evidence of the vaccine rollout. Because if you look at the data, as vaccines have been rolled out, there's clear evidence that the levels of transmission have been suppressed. And, that's very clear in places like Israel, UK, US, where there's high levels of vaccination. So we can almost get to a situation where we can trust the environment, because the risk is significantly reduced. And if we do need to check, if we're not satisfied that the certification of vaccination has been done properly or efficiently, we can have measures in place to deal with that. But it therefore mean that it's not a one shop approach. We'll have different approaches that can be implemented. But I think these are minor issues compared to the challenge we face at the moment, where pretty much everywhere has their borders closed to international travel, or significant restrictions to border travel.
Okay. And then also on vaccination, we have a question from China asking about recognition of vaccines that are administered in China. Are you concerned that Chinese travelers could face difficulty in moving around the world, given that they've been vaccinated with vaccines that are in some cases not recognized by the governments, particularly in Europe?
No, but personally, I'm not concerned about that, because again, as the data becomes available, it will help the situation. Interestingly, again, if you look at the UK data for people traveling from China into the UK, from memory, I don't think there was a single person that flew into the UK that ended up in that regime of either hotel quarantine or self-isolation that tested positive for coronavirus. So when we move on to the next question, I'll just go back and refresh the data. But from memory, I don't recall there being a single passenger tested under that regime from China that tested positive. So I think as more data becomes available, I think we'll see greater willingness of governments, the EU in particular, to acknowledge the vaccination that has been done by other vaccines. It's all going to be data driven, and I think the data that's becoming available will provide evidence that will support acceptance of these vaccines.
Great, thank you, Willie. We have also in a similar sort of trajectory, we have another question about vaccination, this time concerning the US, where the government has said it doesn't anticipate a centralized vaccine registry or vaccine passport system. So given that, how optimistic can we be that the G7 might move on the issue or take leadership in terms of setting standardized requirements and harmonizing their implementation? Willie, did you want to take that?
Yes, but before I do, I've just checked the data. So for China, in that 6-week period, there were 5,548 people traveled from China into the UK. There were 4 people who tested positive, a positivity rate of 0.07%. So, I think that's, again, hard evidence to support the view that, it's not based on one criteria. We can use several sources of data to help us in managing the risk, but that to me is a very impressive figure. Only 4 out of 5,548 people. Going back to the G7, I would imagine that the G7 leaders will want to come away from the meeting in Cornwall with a number of positive announcements. I think this would be one of the easy wins for the G7. So I remain optimistic that we can get coordination at a government level and move this forward, because everybody recognizes that we need to get back as quickly as possible to a normal way of operating. I personally don't see that we can eliminate this virus. I'm not a scientist, but based on the data that I see, and what the scientists are saying, I don't think we can eliminate this virus. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. And I think we're learning to live with it much better today than we were 12 months ago. And the risk that we face today is a significantly reduced risk to the risk we faced 12 months ago.
Okay, thanks very much, Willie. Previously, Willie, you've expressed some frustration with infrastructure providers increasing costs or proposing charges increases at this time. And you called out Heathrow and you also called out IATA. Have you seen any progress there? Are you happy with their response? How do you see that issue developing?
No, I think we'll need to continue to shine the spotlight on this sort of behavior. It's clearly, I think, not just unacceptable, I think it's crazy that at a time when we're trying to do everything we can to get the industry back up and running again, that there are certain people who believe, the right way to do that is to significantly increase their charges. That's complete madness. We need to be able to encourage people to get back. Airports will work and benefit best when they have high volumes of passengers back in the airports again. If they increase their charges, they're just providing an incentive to airlines to suppress the speed of recovery or to look to use their assets somewhere else. And given that, we will have fewer assets available because lots of aircraft have been retired through this, we do need airports really to wake up and understand what's going on at the moment and to play their part. Now's not the time for nice words. Now's the time for action. And sometimes that action is painful, but airlines have had to bear huge pain as we've gone through this. We expect others to bear their fair share of that pain as well.
Okay, we're almost at the top of the hour, so we'll take two last questions. One question references or says that first, the French government has just announced that it's set to unveil restrictions on passengers arriving from the UK, requiring mandatory isolation. I have to say that's fresh news, so I'm not sure that we have that confirmed, but I guess, Willie, the question for you would be, if that's the case, how disappointing would it be?
Well, it's clearly very disappointing. And again, I think we're seeing a political reaction to not to data, but to anecdotes. And as I've said, we're now not dealing with a health risk that's impacting on the industry. We're dealing with political risk. Again, I would encourage governments to look at the data. We're 12 months, 15 months into this crisis. The advances in terms of healthcare have been very significant. The concerns that people had have been largely addressed. The vaccine rollout has been fantastic. Clear scientific evidence that the vaccine suppresses transmission, clear scientific evidence that the vaccine is effective against any of the variants that have been identified. And, I think now's the time for a calm response based on data and risk assessment rather than a knee-jerk reaction to some headlines in the newspapers at this stage. So I would encourage people to, respond based on an accurate assessment of the risk. Everybody will support that. If there's evidence to suggest that the risk is unacceptable, well, then people will support it. But I think the evidence that I would provide you from the UK, where there's a lot of data being made available publicly, and actually we call for more of this data to become available, shows that the level of risk that we're having to manage is actually very, very small.
Okay, great, thanks very much, Willie. We'll give the last word to Brian, as this will probably be his last press briefing with us. We called for difficult questions for Brian. Unfortunately, I didn't receive any particularly difficult ones, but I suppose, Brian, any parting thoughts from your side? And also a question from a journalist asking if you've got airline stocks in your retirement portfolio.
Of course. This is certainly a great industry for the wider economy. I mean, it's the connections it provides for business and tourism. It brings enormous benefits. So I think we need to get that. This is not just about the airlines. This is about supporting the wider economy. It's about supporting businesses, trade and investments, location decisions. This is important. It's important to get governments to work together to have a roadmap to lower those restrictions on international travel for the benefit that this brings to the wider economy as well as the industry that we're working in.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. And I think on behalf of the journalists that have followed us through this crisis and for many years before that, I know there's a lot of thanks for your insight into the industry, your guidance over the past years as to what to expect in terms of industry development. So I think everyone wishes you well in the future, and we'll miss your frequent interaction with the media.
Thank you.
Great. With that, I think we'll call this briefing to a close. We're just over the top of the hour now. So thank you everybody for joining us, and please be on the lookout in your inboxes for invites to future press briefings, which we hope to schedule in the not too distant future. Thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day and rest of the week.